Welcome to Harcum College. I could not imagine about 2 years ago what started as a general curiosity about the history of one house expanded into a project to document the Victorian buildings that are or once were on Harcum's campus in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. My name is Margi Tucker DeTemple, and I am the wife of Harcum's president, John J. DeTemple. I am a local girl. I was born and raised in Bryn Mawr, and this was my family's home for 44 years, located on the original Radnor Hunt Club property. We believe it was once a huntsman's house. It was there where my curiosity for if these walls could talk began. Just like people, buildings have a story to tell. We are in front of Melville Hall, and this grand Greek revival on this street has a story to share too. And what I've discovered was the people that lived in these houses were the star influencers of their time. They were instrumental in the development of the town of Bryn Mawr in the mid-19th century. The Harcum Mile name originates from this beautiful couple, Edith Longwood Hatcher and Octavius Marvin Harcum, founders of Harcum College. Now, Edith initially moved to Bryn Mawr at the suggestion of her sister, Dr. Ori Latham Hatcher. Edith, an accomplished pianist, accepted a position in 1909 at the Shipley School to head the music department. Then in 1912, while in New York, and on her way to Vienna with plans for a concert career, she met Octavius. A year later, they were married in Newcastle, Delaware. Together, the newlyweds moved back to Bryn Mawr with plans to start a school in this house at the intersection of Morris and Montgomery Avenues. Mrs. Harcum's stated goal was to start a school where the individual talent of each girl would be treated as an integral part of her education. To help her plan the curriculum, she had as consultants her sister Ori, a faculty member at Bryn Mawr College, a faculty member from Harvard University, and the president of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. Edith was committed to providing a strong academic program. In 1915, with vision and drive, the Harcum Postgraduate School opened with 3 students, 5 pianos, and the Harcum's 2 small children. In the 1940s, the Harcum School underwent a period of great expansion, and with each house acquisition, the further the women had to walk to attend class, and so the block became known as the Harcum Mile. In 1953, Pennsylvania granted the school the right to be the first 2-year college to confer an Associate of Arts and Associate of Science degrees. Join me as I take you on the Harcum Mile history tour. So why are the Harcum Mile houses important to Bryn Mawr's history? Well, frankly, real estate development. In 1869, the Grand Bryn Mawr Station and the railroad's almost completed luxury Keystone Hotel were the catalyst for Bryn Mawr's development. Before Bryn Mawr, this town was known as Humphreysville because of the number of Humphrey families that farmed and had businesses in the area. The railroad needed to straighten out the curve of the rail line from a nearby stop in Whitehall and place the new station right behind where our Melville Hall will be built 50 years later. Once completed, the railroad knew that they would have unused land to sell. So while the station and hotel were being built, the savvy railroad execs were planning the subdivision of the unused land to develop the area as a major summer destination. Harcum's land originates from that subdivision. Does that make sense? In the history of Bryn Mawr, Barbara Farrow wrote that one of the most important residential sections in Bryn Mawr was the Pennsylvania Railroad development along Montgomery Avenue when the grand houses were built. The community is widely known today as the Main Line. The Main Line was named for the stations leading from Center City, Philadelphia, westward, Overbrook to Bryn Mawr, and ending at Paoli. The silly acronym, Old Maids Never Wed and Have Babies, was a trick to remember the stops from Philadelphia: Overbrook, Marin, Narberth, Wynwood, Ardmore, Haverford, and Bryn Mawr. Melville Hall was built by Henry L. Reinhold. This Greek Revival building certainly made a statement in the community that the Harcum Postgraduate School belonged in the academic space with its neighboring colleges. But this isn't what it originally looked like. This 1881 map of the properties along the Pennsylvania Railroad shows the proximity between the hotel, the Bryn Mawr Station, and Joseph Leslie's house, which would become Harcum's first schoolhouse. The land outlined in blue is the Harcum Mile land. In December of 1868, a year before the Bryn Mawr Station was completed, Joseph Leslie, secretary to the Pennsylvania Railroad, was the first to purchase a lot of land where Melville Hall stands today. Mr. Leslie is an important player in Bryn Mawr and Harcum's history. Bryn Mawr was heavily marketed by the Pennsylvania Railroad as an elite summer resort and summer community. And back in 1868, in an effort to attract people to this area, the railroad execs wanted to change the town's name from Humphreysville, named after the original Welsh farm owners, to a less rural name, a name that would match its new image, a modern-day branding. We know from Pennsylvania Railroad minutes that Mr. Leslie was appointed a committee of one to choose less rustic names for the stations along the railroad. The name he selected for Humphreysville was Bryn Mawr. Mr. Leslie was said to have been inspired by the name of the area's first homestead owned by Roland Ellis, called Bryn Mawr, meaning Great Hill. Here I am at the Harrison House, a museum in Bryn Mawr, and originally the home of Roland Ellis. The railroad had a lot of land to sell, and development in Bryn Mawr was slow in the beginning. The solution was to insist company officers show support by residing in the new community. The Harcum Mile was home to two Pennsylvania Railroad executives, Samuel Ray, the 9th president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and Joseph Leslie, secretary to the Pennsylvania Railroad, plus one supplier to the railroad, Edward B. Fox, vice president of Queen & Company and the first owner of our home, the President's House. It took 10 years for Mr. Leslie to build a 2-story stone house with a porch. There was no barn at first and was a third of the size of Melville today. Unfortunately, a year after completion, Mr. Leslie contracts tuberculosis and resigns from his position as secretary. He sells the house to William Harrison Weimer. Mr. Leslie moves to Columbia, South Carolina, where he passes away several years later. In 1883, Mr. Weimer and his wife, Essie Griffin, named the house Weimercroft. Mr. Weimer was a wealthy Philadelphia shoe manufacturer and one of the most respected in the industry. He was a member of the Union League of Philadelphia and director of the Bryn Mawr National Bank and the Bryn Mawr Trust Company. In 1907, the first Mrs. Weimer passes away at Weimercroft. Mr. Weimer remarries Mrs. Anna Beckwith Alexander of Baltimore in Monumental City. She was widely known in Baltimore society. And after their wedding trip to England, they would live in Weimercroft in Bryn Mawr until his death in 1912. He was known for his geniality, old-school curiosity, and good cheer. And at his funeral, practically every employee of the company, numbering in the several hundred, attended. So what did the house look like? We know very little. This is the only image we have of the view from Montgomery Avenue. And what you can see is the Weimer's second-floor bay window addition over the first-floor circular porch frame. The next owner was John L. Kinsey. And in 1914, Edith and Octavius Harcum arrive in Bryn Mawr and rent from Mr. Kinsey to start the Harcum Postgraduate School. So what were the neighbors thinking? It was considered quite audacious for this young couple to open a school for young women with no money, little administrative experience, and in a town where the educational standards would be compared to that of Bryn Mawr College. On top of that, World War I had just begun. But nothing would deter the Harcums from opening the school. In 1915, the Harcum Postgraduate School opened with 3 students, 5 pianos, a newborn boy, William Marvin, who they called Bubber, and his 14-month-old sister, Edith Virginia, called Jean. Here is a photo of Mrs. Harcum in the center with her students sitting in the second-floor bay window that the Weimers added. By 1917, the Harcums were able to purchase the house for Mr. Kinsey and name the house Melville Hall after Marguerite Melville Lesniewska, a famous concert pianist with whom Edith became acquainted during her studies with Theodore Lecheski in Vienna. They went straight to work on 2 major construction projects. All in one place, the house would provide instruction, recreation, meals, and housing for both the Harcums and the students. Now, the first project was to expand the existing stone building to upgrade the heating and electric, add a 3rd floor, a slate roof to house 70 students, several pianos, classrooms, administrative offices, and a dining room. The $35,000 contract was awarded to architect Henry L. Reinhold Jr. and the Standard Construction Company. Completed in 1919, the Harcums tripled the size of the schoolhouse and removed a section of the barn. And as you can see, portions of the original building still remain. This 1930s photo gives you the best comparison. The 2-story bay windows influenced the design of the building we see today. This is the original Dutch door to the back porch. Now, why do I know it was the back porch? Because the front door would never have been underneath the staircase. A Dutch door is split where the top half swings independently from the bottom half. It allowed half of the door to be closed, but have fresh air pass through. No such thing as air conditioning back then. This 1957 photo shows the original carved double mahogany front door that stood about 9 feet high. The original orientation of the front of the house faced the field and the station, not Montgomery Avenue. I just love this photo from the late 20s. The map showed me that the driveway was always accessed from Morris Avenue, leading past this modest front porch to a barn. Now remember, these houses started as summer homes and less formal compared to the city. The lawn intentionally faced the very fashionable Bryn Mawr station, where one could sit and watch the comings and goings of the day. Now, 3 years later, the Little Theater and Caribbean Dormitory were added by well-known architects Paul Critt and John E. Harbison of Philadelphia. The addition provided second and third floor residence space. Caribbean Hall was named for Mrs. Harcum's family home at Caribbean Hall, Fork Union, Virginia. The first floor was designed for exercise space and theater productions, and it was called the Little Theater. Now, in the U.S., around the turn of the 20th century, there was a Little Theater movement. Small amateur community playhouses opened across the country to allow works of lesser-known playwrights to be performed. Drama was popular with the Harcum students from the very early days, well into the 1980s. The Little Theater was renovated in 2011. It was renamed in honor of Kevin D. Marlowe, son of trustee Dennis Marlowe, who died in the World Trade Center attacks on September 11, 2001. And here is Mrs. Harcum enjoying afternoon tea with her students in the Little Theater in 1936. Tea was a regular pastime at the school. Now here is a comparison of the Little Theater edition in 1926 to 2022. Harcum no longer has a drama department. The renovated room is used for an all-purpose event space. Now, tragedy hit the Harcums in 1920. While driving, Edith's husband, Octavius, was in a car accident on Lancaster Avenue in Overbrook, Pennsylvania. Edith and a family friend, Mrs. Willis, were injured too. A fourth passenger, Mrs. Willis's daughter, was killed. Edith's husband succumbed to his injuries and died at Bryn Mawr Hospital. He was only 33 years old. Now think of the strength that Edith had. Her husband was gone. She had 2 little children. They just completed 2 additions to Melville Hall, and in the world's perspective, the First World War was just over. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution just allowed women to vote. My conversations with alumni have been invaluable to understand college life. Kathleen Drescher McCoy, class of 1944, and I had a 2-hour discussion when she was well into her 90s, and her memory was fantastic. Kathy was raised in Ballackinwood, Pennsylvania. Because it was during the Second World War, she chose the Harcum School to be close to home. Kathy studied fashion design, and all her classes were held in Melville Hall. The main room to gather with classmates, she said, was in this living room. The room was used to receive visitors, host dignitaries, as well as classes. There were very strict rules for ladies to follow. Maxine Spector Greenfield, class of 59, said the house mother met all the gentlemen in this room when they were picking up their dates to ensure the men were suitable. Curfew from Sunday to Thursday was 8 p.m., Fridays was 10 p.m., and Saturdays was at 11 p.m. Mac, as she preferred, loved to go to Philadelphia to see a show or go into Bryn Mawr for a movie. Because of the curfew, in her 2 years at Harcum, she never saw the end of a movie or play. Now, this is the same room in 1917 with the Poetry Club by the fire before the 1919 renovation. Now, to identify the location of photos, I discovered a helpful hint. All the fireplace mantles in Melville Hall are different, and I will show you what I mean. The mantle in this room has a hole at each bracket. Now, this is the same room after the renovation. Now, notice the same hole on the side of the mantle. The room was brightened up with wallpaper and white paint compared to 1917. The Victorian style of darker paneled wood was updated and brightened. Now, I love both styles, but if faced with a choice, please don't paint original wood paneling or trim. Enjoy the character of the wood in its original glory. Today, the same room is the office of the student records. Now, Kathy Drescher McCoy was a talented artist and graduated in 1944 with a degree in fashion design. To my surprise, she was hired to paint the portraits of 2 Harcum presidents, Dr. Michael Doozy and Dr. Patricia Ryan, under the name Kathleen Buffum. Married 4 times, Kathy was a resident of Waverly Heights, which was once the home of Mr. Samuel Ray, who I previously mentioned was the 9th president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Kathy passed away in August 2021, and if it hadn't been for this project, we would not know her special contribution to Harcum. Now, here are some interior photos from the college's archive collection compared to today. This is the lobby in 1919 and the lobby today. It is relatively unchanged, but notice the door by the fireplace. On the other side of the lobby is the president's reception area, and you can see the lobby door to the left of the fireplace has been removed. Once Mrs. Harcum's music studio, today is the office of the president. Now take a look at this bedroom from the 1920s. Melville uses it as a second-floor conference room, which is the bay window over the president's office. This second-floor bedroom is now the student accounts office. The smoking lounge for the ladies was adjoined to this room, and as you would imagine, smoking was popular through the decades. During wartime, the ladies rolled their own cigarettes. Now, this adorable sun-filled room is on the second floor too, and is an office and financial aid. Lovely dinner parties were a big part of campus life. For the parties, every room on the first floor, even the hallways, were used for guest seating. Look how many women could be seated in the Marvin B. Leviti's boardroom. Adjacent to Melville Hall is a portion of what was once an outbuilding and a barn. Naming a house a cottage was very popular for the period, and I will do my best not to make this confusing. In 1926, the schoolhouse barn was used for resident housing and called it the cottage. Just beyond the steps was a lovely garden leading to a restaurant, the cottage tea room, which will not be owned by Harcum until 1944, at which time they named it the cottage. Now, at the other end of the mile was the cottage dining room, which you will learn about later. Today, it is home to the Harcum College Bears athletic department. Mrs. Harcum encouraged exercise and sports for all students. So, this leads me to a recent discovery in Melville Hall. The original 1919 gymnasium was discovered 2 stories below the boardroom. From alumni conversations, I learned that dance and ping pong and even club meetings were held in the basement of Melville. There were photos, but no way to know where the photos were taken. The basement, as I know it, did not have a room big enough for exercise space of any kind. I was aware of an inaccessible space below the basement with no stairs, but told it was small, so I disregarded it. Now, fast forward a year to this August, new clues were found, giving reason to investigate the space with no stairs. Roxanne Sutton, the college archivist, and I, armed with a 1920s photo and a 1942 resident hall photo to help us compare walls, descended down this shaft by means of a long stepladder. And ducking under this door, we entered into a large room where a floor had been built on top of it. I asked for a wet mop, and after a few brushes of the mop, the old basketball court was revealed. Roxanne went back upstairs to compare the 1930s image with the space directly above it. She quickly discovered our provenance. The ceiling radiators shown in the 1930s photo are still in use. The original windows are the ground level windows on the east side corner of Melville Hall. Melville alone was the heart and soul of the Harcum School, and it served as a dormitory and schoolhouse, plus all school recreational activities occurred within Melville or on the grounds until 1945, when Hatcher Hall was purchased. The years in the 1950s look like the most fun. This is the earliest known photograph of a section of the Harcum Mile at the corner of Montgomery Avenue and Morris Avenues. Taken from the Keystone Hotel in 1876, the photographer Frederick Gunquist captures some of the area's earliest photographs for the Pennsylvania Railroad. The very first building on the Harcum Mile is the cottage on the left. Built in the early 1870s in the stick style, the cottage was once the Pennsylvania Railroad foreman's house for the Bryn Mawr station. The foreman's house photo gives a wonderful snapshot of a day in the life. In the distance, we see the proximity of the Bryn Mawr station, and the land to the right of the foreman's house would be purchased by Joseph Leslie. His house will eventually be rented by Edith and Octavius Harcum to start a school. Now, this cottage was the first building Harcum purchased in its expansion. At one time, the building was the cottage tea room, a favorite with the Harcum co-eds, famous for its ice cream and chocolate sauce over chocolate cake. Yum. And in the early years, Marvin, as he preferred to be called, and Edith lived in the main schoolhouse, Melville Hall. And as the student body grew, President Edith Harcum resided in the cottage for a time before retiring in 1952. She passed away in 1958 at the age of 80. The view of the cottage tea room is seen in the background of this 1931 photo. These Harcum bathing beauties were members of the swimming club, and as far as we know, Harcum never had a pool. Students swam at the Baldwin School that was once the Bryn Mawr Hotel. It was the stick-style detail that helped me to compare unidentified photos and location of the cottage early in my research. The stick style was an emerging style in the 1870s and used for a relatively humble building. I believe it was a representation of the image the Pennsylvania Railroad wanted to project. Nothing but the best. These then and now photos give you an idea of where the cottage once stood on Harcum's campus. The 1921 photo also gives you an idea of the view of the hotel just beyond the trees as visitors entered the station. With few trees obstructing the view, the hotel would have been an awesome sight for arriving visitors. The next president to reside in the cottage was President Philip Klein and First Lady Esther Klein, who moved into the house in 1953. This photo was taken by the local paper announcing their move. The cottage would be the Klein's college residence until 1963, when it was razed to make room for the construction of Klein Hall. The presidential residence would relocate to where my husband and I live, just 3 doors up the street. The Kleins were the grandparents of our current board president, Dr. Alex Klein. Located across Morris Avenue from Melville Hall, Hatcher Hall was the second house to be purchased. Built in the Victorian era, which is Queen Victoria's reign in England from 1837 to 1901, it would be purchased by Harcum in 1945 for additional resident and academic space. It was named Hatcher Hall after Edith's family and father, the Reverend Dr. William E. Hatcher, a prominent preacher in Virginia. Harcum sold it in 2004. This house was once owned by famed architect Addison Hutton. He built it next to his brother-in-law's home. The date of the house is probably 1876 because Frederick Guncus, the photographer, captured some of the area's earliest photographs, and a section of the unfinished house can be seen in one of these photos. Addison Hutton was an integral part to the development of Bryn Mawr. He was commissioned by the Pennsylvania Railroad to build several homes at Bryn Mawr. We just haven't been able to definitively determine which ones they commissioned him to design. We do know there were a few others on this block alone. First, Mr. and Mrs. Hutton's house, Stormfort, which no longer stands, was built on the corner of Radnor Street and Montgomery Avenue, directly across from Harcum College's president's house, right there, which has been attributed to him too. His brother Finley Hutton, also an architect, built a home on the Harcum Mile, which you will learn more about later. Now, focus on the house in the background. It belonged to Dr. William Savory, the brother-in-law to Mr. Hutton. Although not technically on the Harcum Mile, 40 Morris, which stands in its place, was recently used for classroom space for Harcum's photography program. The Savory's house is important for 2 reasons. First, you get to see the high-pitched roof style so common in Hutton's designs. And 2, Mr. Hutton's diaries describe when and why he bought the property adjacent to his brother-in-law. This property will become Hatcher Hall. Mr. Hutton never lived there. It was built to provide a base for unmarried relatives. Mr. Hutton was a prolific and well-respected architect in the Bryn Mawr area and Philadelphia. Some of his buildings can also be found on other local campuses today, such as Bryn Mawr College, Haverford College, and the Shipley School. In 1885, Hutton sold the house to Mr. Samuel Ray, and Mr. Ray would become the 9th president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. In 1900, Mr. Ray and Alexander Cassatt, who was president of the Pennsylvania Railroad at the time, led the New York Tunnel Extension project. Mr. Ray also led the construction of Penn Station in New York City. He became known as a dominating figure in the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, 4 years before he bought the house, Mr. Ray had hired Hutton to build a country estate in Gladwyne, Pennsylvania called Waverly Heights. He and his wife, Mary Black, had 2 children, George and Ruth. Mr. Ray retired to Waverly Heights until his death in 1929. By 1955, Hatcher Hall housed the library on the 1st floor, residential and academic space on the 2nd and 3rd floors. Hatcher Hall provided a private room for commuter students if they needed to spend the night. One of those commuter students was Abigail Wright Green, class of 55. Known as Gail Wright as a student, she was a retail merchandising student and a longtime friend of late Harcum trustee Beatrice Carpenter Blackman. Both ladies were leaders in their class, as Bea was class president and Gail was vice president. I had the chance to speak with Gail, who shared her memories as a Harcum commuter student of life in Hatcher Hall. Gail said all meals were served across the street in Melville Hall in what is now the Marvin B. Levites boardroom. She described the food as a ladies' luncheon with tablecloths and table service, so civilized and ladylike. And being a foodie, I asked Gail about the meal she remembered. And what quickly came to mind was her being served a baked stuffed Bermuda onion. She said the Hamburg Hearth in Bryn Mawr was also a popular place to eat with her friends. Now, Hatcher Hall fell into disrepair and was sold by the college. It has been 20 years since Harcum owned Hatcher Hall, but I am happy to say it was remodeled into luxury condos, and the exterior appears to be unchanged. The Harcum School was growing rapidly, and 2 houses were purchased in 1946 to accommodate the expanding enrollment. One was this house, Bedford Hall, and the other was Latham Hall. Bedford Hall is one of 5 houses that remain on the Mile today. The style of Bedford Hall was based on a design by Francis and William L. Price and constructed by Wendell and Smith. The design was created for the North Wayne development, and the building was named after Bedford County, Virginia, the area where Edith Harcum's father was raised. The house is a half-frame Dutch colonial bungalow and originally had a shingle-style exterior. A Dutch colonial roof is also referred to as a gambrel style, and the style's purpose was to create a 3rd floor, but to reduce the roof line so as not to be so high. The shingle style was varied wood shingles, covered exterior walls and roof surfaces, seen well in this old drawing. The roof shingle style is called fish scale, for obvious reasons, don't you think? So the low front profile of a bungalow is seen here. What you can also see here are the unusual turnings in the pillars. These pillars are a signature style of the architect, and a drive down North Wayne Avenue in Wayne, Pennsylvania, you'll see plenty of examples. The property once included a barn that can be seen here during the construction of Klein Hall in 1963. Note the Dutch colonial roof of the house is mirrored on the barn. The barn was eventually razed, and in its place is the Cohen Dental Building. In 1889, sisters Virginia and Mary Garber were the first owners. Mary passed away in 1898 at the age of 47. Virginia Wright Garber is listed in the 1910 U.S. Census as head of household and single. Her occupation was listed as a portrait painter and artist. She taught drawing and modeling at Bryn Mawr College. This is an illustration by Virginia Wright Garber. Virginia lived here until 1926. And here is a photo of the interior in 1942 with the resident students compared to the office today. The room has been thoughtfully preserved. Note the staircase railing called a balustrade hasn't changed a bit, and I love that. So welcome to the interior of Bedford Hall. Bedford was once called the Wayside Inn before Harcum purchased it, and signs of the old inn can be seen over the doorways here. Do you see this? And there are some beautiful characteristics to this home. One, which is so unusual these days, is having a working pocket door. Come on over here and see the fireplace. This fireplace is one of my favorites. Look at this unusual brickwork. Isn't it lovely? Merle Holman, class of 1956, has remained a very active member of the Alumni Association. Harcum College awarded her the Alumni Achievement Award in 2020. Merle majored in communications, advertising, public relations, and was one of just 3 students in her program in Bedford Hall. I got a kick out of seeing her photo in the 1955 play Cry Havoc. She loved theater and even lent her voice to Villanova's radio station when they needed a female voice. Some of the activities she enjoyed were ping pong, backgammon, and swimming. In the 1960s, Bedford was used as the nursery school for early childhood program. Today, it houses institutional advancement and some of the offices of the dental programs. Next door to Bedford Hall is the first of 3 houses which were speculative houses commissioned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music, the President's House, and the Colonial Inn. Now, Mr. Hutton has been attributed as the architect for the President's House, and as you've learned, Addison Hutton was commissioned to build several houses in Bryn Mawr. We just haven't proven the ones that the railroad has asked him to build. I think he had a hand in all 3. Now, once the work was completed on the railroad and the Bryn Mawr station was built, the remaining land was divided to sell as resident lots. The railroad put many restrictions on the deed of sale, and here are some of the restrictions. A buyer had to spend a minimum of $8,000, commence construction within 2 years, and complete within 3 years. There were to be no hotels, taverns, drinking saloons, blacksmith shops, tanneries, or any offensive occupation. Architecturally, the buildings were to be above ordinary. Isn't this porch lovely? I covet this porch. Next door to Bedford Hall is this perfect gem. Designed as one of the 3 speculative houses by the Pennsylvania Railroad to entice development, it is owned by the Barone family and has housed the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music since 1934. This home has been lovingly preserved to retain most of its original character, and certainly not ordinary. The style is typical Second Empire architecture, with a large mansard roof and segmental arched dormer windows. The style of the 3rd spec house in the series matches this house. In 1888, the first private owner was Anna H. Smith. She and her husband, William, had 1 daughter, Emma. Then the house passed through 2 women in the Barnes family, Lucy S. Barnes and then to Natalie S. Barnes, who sold it to the Barone family. The Barones became custodians in 1934 and founded the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music. Dr. Barone was a faculty member at Harcum College. He was the director of the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music until he died in 1988. His widow, Mrs. Katharina Bloom Barone, is now the director along with their son, Mark Antonio Barone, the assistant director. Now, this is Katharina Bloom's 1952 yearbook photo. She graduated from Lower Merion High School and the Harcum School. And prior to Harcum, Dr. Barone was her private voice teacher and the music teacher at Harcum, so she enrolled with the goal of having a singing career, in which she was very successful. I visited with Mrs. Barone and her son Tony in June 2021, and Tony shared the fun story of how his father found this house. Now, around 1933, Tony's father had just returned from the sanatorium, having recovered from tuberculosis. He was expected to die, but did not because he fell in love with his nurse, Anna, whom he eventually married. One afternoon, Joseph and Anna were taking a walk and passed by the house. It was in disrepair and was so overgrown it could not be seen from the street. So mischievously, they walked onto the property and up this front porch to take a closer look. They peered through this window, and what they saw reminded them of a house in the 1933 movie Berkeley Square. Upon seeing this room, Dr. Barone had a vision for them and the conservatory. And although they did not have the money to buy the house, he spoke with a real estate agent and asked if he and his wife could live there rent-free if they promised to make repairs to the house themselves. She responded, "That is the best offer I have heard yet." The first winter, there was no heat, but with their own hands, they fixed up this gorgeous house and opened the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music. They were able to purchase it by 1946, and the house remains in mostly its original condition from when the Barones took ownership. Sadly, Anna died young. Let's take a closer look inside. The house has 3 floors, 8 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and 8 pianos. This is the original front door. And if you turn around, you face the stairs. The parlor is through the French doors, and the waiting room is on the left. Now, the dining room can be accessed through the mahogany pocket doors. Oh, the dinner parties I could imagine here. The dining room is the largest room on the first floor and was most likely intended for more than just dining. One fun feature was under the carpet. This was once a button located at the end of the table where the lady of the house sat. She would call for service by discreetly pressing the button with her foot without interrupting the conversation. This lovely French door at the end of the dining room leads to a heated enclosed porch. At one time, the porch wrapped around 3 sides. Today, it is where Tony Barone gives piano lessons. On a mild evening, I can hear him beautifully playing. From the dining room, you pass through the butler's pantry with original wood cabinetry to the sizable yet modest and cozy kitchen. The appliances are not the star of this room, but rather the sense of warmth and the privilege to be able to step back into a simpler time. The back room of the kitchen is fully functional and literally takes you back in time. The double wash sinks are not used anymore. This room alone stirs up the imagination of what a day in the life of the family would have been like in the 40s. How about this gem, the original porch commode? Let's take a quick look upstairs. The hardwood floors throughout the house have a lovely patina. The history is evident due to the family walking patterns for over 140 years. Other details that are unusual to find are the working transom windows over the bedroom doors. The 1940s wallpaper has been restored and sections replaced. This French-inspired room with the bay window would have been the primary room. So behind me is the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music's barn. Now, it is the only surviving example of a barn on the Harcum Mile. The living quarters on the second floor were used by the carriage drivers, but when Dr. Baroni was alive, he used one of the rooms as his art studio. Dr. Baroni was a very talented painter. He was great friends with Harcum's art teacher, Martin Zippen. Tony shared another funny story about his painting Maud Marin's portrait. She was the college administrator for 41 years. Now, Dr. Baroni and Mr. Zippen both painted her portrait at the same time. Now, Dr. Baroni's style was to paint the most glamorous version of a person. Mr. Zippen painted her as she was. And when they presented her with their painting, she turned to Dr. Baroni and said, "It's worthless." And she turned to Mr. Zippen, "I earned every one of those wrinkles." Well, let's go next door to our house. Welcome to Harcum College's President's House. As you can see, we're just a few steps away from the Conservatory. And this house is very special, and as old houses are, they always need attention. My husband and I have been chipping away at various projects to bring the old gal back to life. Now, over the years, there have been a lot of changes, and I've studied every nook and cranny to get the best picture of what it originally looked like. Now, the first clues are right here. This is a scar on the exterior where the porch once was, and the windows were much longer under the porch. The house was built in the Carpenter Gothic style. Here is a side-by-side comparison from 1964 to today, so you can see why I wish I had my neighbor's porch. The exterior of the house has been altered quite a bit. Discovering this photo filled me with excitement and such sadness. The beautiful porch is gone, and the architectural details that gave the house personality and balance were gone with it. Let's go inside. Come on in. The first private owner was Edward Brown Fox and Anita Latham Futhi, who purchased the home in 1887 for $9,500, which was a lot more than the railroad's minimum. He was just 24 years old, and they had recently wed in Westchester. Mr. Fox was vice president of Queen & Company, which manufactured electrical and optical equipment and was a supplier to the Pennsylvania Railroad. As Edward Fox was an officer and a supplier to the railroad, he would have been strongly enticed to take up residence in Bryn Mawr. Now, the railroad commissioned an architect to build these houses to attract buyers to the street. And as you can see, one looks nothing like the other, but they are similar, and I want to show you the characteristics of both houses that prove their relationship, and secondly, may prove that Addison Hutton was the architect for all three spec houses. All three buildings had a similar property and house dimensions. Each had a bay on the left-hand side and a wraparound porch and extended a portion out the back. Addison Hutton's home was directly across the street. It would be very plausible that he would choose to design the very houses he could see from his front porch. Now, this is an advertisement for the first hotel in Bryn Mawr, the Keystone Hotel. And I believe Hutton's home is the first home in the distance. Stormfort stood across the street from the president's house until the late 1950s and was located on the property that today is part of Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church. That lot was purchased for $1,600 from the Pennsylvania Railroad, and a bargain compared to the properties directly across the street on Montgomery Avenue, priced at a minimum of $8,000. He sold it in 1890 for $23,000. Not a bad investment at all. The president's house has 3 floors containing 5 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a living room where I'm filming, and a dining room, a parlor, a kitchen, and a great room that was once the location of the back porch. The original porch was enclosed before Harcum acquired it. Now, above the kitchen on the second floor is a 6th bedroom that was likely a sleeping porch. Hutton was described as having restraint in his style. What I find so interesting is this house has a double personality, like a feminine and masculine side. The east side view has a feminine, light, airy porch, and on the west side has a strong, masculine Italianate characteristics. The Italianate influence has the double bay windows. Now, the blue dot shows the original roofline and the rear addition, which was originally the sleeping porch. In comparison to the west side of the conservatory, notice the same bay windows and Italianate influence, a common detail in all 3 spec houses. After visiting the conservatory, I was able to compare the newel posts and the balustrades. They are exactly the same, making it plausible that Hutton was the architect for all 3 Pennsylvania Railroad spec houses. The house passed through the Fox family until 1900, when the census records showed the couple moved to Bronx, New York. Now, jumping to 1938, Ellen Clifton Wharton and her sister Rosa operated the Miss Wharton School in this house, a private school for girls and boys of varying ages. Ellen and Rosa would run the Miss Wharton School until 1958 before retiring. The Wharton sisters are descendants of Thomas Wharton Jr., the first president of Pennsylvania after the independence in 1776. This title would be equal to a governor today. Miss Ellen Wharton passed away in 1969 at the age of 89 in Orlando, Florida. Now, the Napa Corporation purchased the property but failed to get permits for what we think was for an auto parts retail store. Can you imagine? The property was resold to Harcum College in 1964. I was fortunate to find Carol Ingram Ziegler via Facebook's Mainline Memories group. Carol attended the Miss Wharton School from 1948 to 1950. At age 4, Carol loved the school and could describe the house to me in great detail, which helped me to imagine what the house used to look like. A day at school was described like this. So Carol was born and raised in Ardmore, and every day when her mother drove up to the house, she could see a large gray circular sign for the Miss Wharton School on the front lawn. Her mother would turn into the stone driveway that stopped at the front porch steps. Her mother dreaded the driveway because she had to back out onto Montgomery Avenue. You wouldn't do that today. Miss Ellen Wharton greeted all the students every day at the steps, and if the weather was bad, students were greeted at the tall double wood front door, painted gray. Miss Wharton's sister, Rosa, was rarely seen. Now, once inside, the children would hang their coats on pegs to the left of the front door. This was the entrance to Miss Wharton's office and was once the parlor or library. Her description didn't make sense to me because there isn't enough wall space on either side of the door for the students to hang their coats, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, we are sitting here in what was the classroom, which had 2 tables for 12 children and dark purple and brown curtains on the windows that went to the floor. Carol remembered finger painting and making Mother's Day cards. Now, the front stairs were carpeted a tan color, and the floors were once covered in linoleum flooring. At lunchtime, the children would line up and walk down the hall and turn left under the stairs to get to the kitchen, which is our dining room now. Now, this was so fantastic. The school's kitchen sink and stove were located in the left corner of the bay window. This room was also used for music lessons. A piano was located at the other end of the room, and she remembers singing Frere Jacques. For recess, they would play in the sandbox or on the swings in the backyard. And on special days, they were allowed to watch the trains go by through the metal fence. After the Miss Wharton School, Carol attended Friends School Haverford, as did I, which coincidentally, we had the same science teacher, Mr. Cadbury. Shadows. A shadow is a sign of something that once was there. Shadows are how a house speaks to me. So let me show you a couple of examples. So right here, this doorway is obviously wide. Now, these shadows appeared to me very recently, and I took these photos on the spot because the light was just right. The shadows confirmed Carol's description hanging coats on the wall. You can see how high and wide the door once was. The doorways were much narrower and higher, allowing for a wider area for the coat pegs. Other clues that changes were made were much more obvious to the naked eye. One doorway has the 1960s trim, and the other has nothing at all. Now, I can't move on to the next house without showing you examples of the leaded stained glass windows in the president's house. The 3rd floor triangular window, called a pendament of a rising sun, must have been purposeful because that sun shines through them each morning. The long window in the dining room has a fruit basket, and I have often wondered whether this shield is a family crest. The college took this photo just after the porch was removed in 1965. President Doozy and his large family were the first to live in the house, and I believe made the most changes during his tenure. Next door to the president's house was the 3rd speculative house, commissioned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. This house became the Colonial Inn in the 1920s. The inn was a popular boarding house for over 50 years. It also stood long after the college's academic center was completed. Harcum purchased it in 1966 and used it for resident hall space before being razed. Now, this student rendering is the only image we have of the front of the Colonial Inn. Like the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music, there is no record of the architect, but the Second Empire design is the same. The first occupants, Harriet and Malin S. Stokes, purchased the building in 1886. We think it was primarily an investment property. Census records in 1900 list his occupation as real estate, and his residence was on Clinton Street in Philadelphia. Mr. Stokes was the first secretary-treasurer of the Union Trust Company, established in 1882. The house changed hands once before it was purchased by W. Hinkle Smith. It is not known if Mr. Smith ever lived here either. He was a very successful and interesting man who was rooted in the Bryn Mawr community. This handsome image of Mr. Smith hangs in Bryn Mawr Hospital because he was a board member for 37 years, having served the longest in the hospital's over 100-year history. Mr. Smith derived a bulk of his wealth from the Guggenheim copper interests. He was an avid horseman and was master of the foxhounds at the Radnor Hunt Club from 1901 to 1907. Now, my family's house was on the Radnor Hunt property, which means Mr. Smith most likely walked on the section of land my family owned. He was also a neighbor. Now, Mr. Smith's sprawling estate called Timberline was just on the other side of the Radnor Hunt Club. And unfortunately, the mansion, built in 1907, was razed in 1976 for the Blue Route. Today, the remaining land is a residential neighborhood. Radnor Township's Ithan Elementary School sits on a section of the Timberline property, too. In 1920, Mary Callanan and her daughter purchased the property and expanded the house for the Colonial Inn. Harcum acquired it in 1966. Now, the Colonial Inn housed a few famous people, one of which was Dorothy Hurd. This is her obituary in Narberth's Our Town paper in 1948. Mrs. Dorothy Campbell Hurd was a member of the Marin Golf Club. She was the only woman golfer ever to hold the United States, British, and Canadian championships at the same time. She won the national title 3 times, and at one time held every major women's championship in the Philadelphia district. Sadly, she was killed on March 23, 1948, when she fell in front of a train in South Carolina. Another famous resident of the Colonial Inn was Admiral Elliott Snow. In wartime, he was head of the naval construction at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. He died of a heart attack at age 73. This is the only image the college has of the middle section of the Harcum Mile houses, and unfortunately, from the backyard perspective during the construction of the Academic Center. I believe that the reason many photos were taken in the 1960s was because they were scheduled for demolition for the college's expansion project. This photo shows the view from the other direction of the Academic Center construction, facing Penswood Hall, which was completed in 1966. Now, next to the Colonial Inn was Owens Hall. In 1882, Mary L. Wright purchased the land, but the house didn't appear on the map until 1887. At the age of 44, this makes Miss Wright one of the first 2 people to purchase land from the Pennsylvania Railroad track, and the first of several women to own property here. Now, in the 1900 census, Miss Wright was 62 years old, and the census recorded 1 boarder and a domestic worker, Matilda McDade, living with her. She was active in the Women's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church for 1 year. The style was American Foursquare. Now, Foursquares are what they sound like. Cube-like, 2.5-story homes with pyramid roofs, a very popular style in the late 19th century. Interesting fact is that Miss Wright appears to have been single and lived in the house for 40 years. In 1921, William H. Ramsey bought the house from Miss Wright, and he rented it to the college in 1942 when this photo was taken. The Ramsey family business in Bryn Mawr was a general store and advertised flour and feed and fancy groceries. Ramsey Hall became part of the Harcum School campus in 1946 and renamed Owens Hall. It accommodated 20 residents and a house director. Now, each residence hall had a resident director and a house director. Now, picture here are 3 co-eds wearing the white blazer. Now, those that earned the white blazer were in the Harcum Club and often house directors. They were leaders in excellent academic standing and best exemplified the ideal Harcum girl. Now, each of the houses on the mile at one time had a barn or carriage house. When Harcum acquired the properties, they repurposed the carriage houses. And in 1959, the carriage house behind Owens Hall became a library and a bookstore. Now, it was moved to Hatcher Hall due to increased housing needs. The only remaining carriage house on the mile is behind the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music. In 1946, Latham Hall was purchased at the same time as Bedford Hall. Built in about 1885, Latham Hall was an American Tudor, described as a half-stone, half-frame house with decorative half-timbers on stucco and high-pitched roofs. The first owners were Mary and Joseph Sagi, who sell it to Louisa Hayden Lyons. In 1905, Louisa is buried in the Church of the Redeemer Cemetery in Bryn Mawr. Her spouse was the Reverend James Gabor Lyons, who predeceased her. In 1914, John Sellers Barnes, a stockbroker, and his sister Natalie sell their house a few doors away to another family member and buy this house. The house they sold would become the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music. So the Barnes family owned two houses on the street at the same time. Mr. Barnes dies in 1930, and it changes ownership to the Girard Trust Company in 1937. Upon acquisition, it was named Latham Hall after Dr. Ori Latham Hatcher, Edith's sister. Dr. Hatcher was an academic in English literature and a pioneer in vocational studies at Bryn Mawr College. And as previously mentioned, she encouraged her sister to move to the Bryn Mawr area and start a school. Here is the backdoor image showing the Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church across the street through the carport. Latham Hall's carriage house served as the Art and Science Building up until the 1960s. The first floor housed the science lab and a lecture hall, and upstairs provided two art studios for resident artist and Division of Fine Arts chairman Martin Zippen. Here's an interior photo of the Latham residences in 1942. Continuing east on Montgomery, Mr. Finley Hutton appears on the map. He was the younger brother to Addison Hutton. Also an architect, Finley worked with his brother for a time, as well as founding a firm of his own. It is not known if Finley Hutton designed the building, but it is likely given his occupation. Purchased in 1884, the wood frame house has the Hutton signature high-pitched roofs. There is a brick barn and an outbuilding. The house has been altered so much by the time this photograph was taken in the mid-1960s that I can't assign it a particular style other than we know it was built in the Victorian era. Now, Finley and Addison had a younger brother, Harmon. And when Harmon contracted consumption, Addison and Finley did all they could to care for him. Because Harmon was in an invalid state, he was brought to the Finleys' home in March of 1884. Now, letters were sent to urge family to visit Harmon. And sadly, Harmon passed away on Friday, May 8, 1884, in Finley's home in Bryn Mawr at the age of 21. And from the deed records, Finley purchased the property the same year his brother Harmon died. In 1889, Finley sold the property to his brother and wife Rebecca, who sold it to Charles F. Humphrey 3 years later. As for the second inn on the street, I would assume the railroad could only control businesses that would be built on the land directly purchased from them, hence the two inns on the street. Also, by 1887, they had other things on their mind. The Keystone Hotel suffered a fire in 1887, and the new hotel would take a couple years to be rebuilt. It became the Bryn Mawr Hotel, designed by famed architect Frank Furness. It was sold to the Baldwin School in 1922. Charles was a direct descendant of one of the first Humphrey families of Bryn Mawr. Charles Humphrey and his wife operated the Humphrey Board House until 1900. Interesting fact, during the 1917 influenza epidemic, the American Red Cross mainline branch was founded and operated an emergency 100-bed hospital out of the Montgomery Inn. By 1945, the board house was called the Montgomery Inn when the 100-room hotel was sold by Joseph Winters to Russell Wilson of Narberth. Now, Mr. Wilson was a graduate of the hotel school at Cornell in 1930 and was a successful manager of several hotels in Florida, New York, and Philadelphia. Now, we lost the trail of ownership until the hotel was purchased by Harcum in 1960 and retains its name as a dormitory and space for a bookstore. This photo shows you just how large the Montgomery Inn became. In 1887, Finley Hutton's neighbor was the Catholic Church, who was building a wood frame structure. The Catholic Church would soon move to another location because they couldn't meet the 3-year requirement to complete construction as agreed to in the Pennsylvania Railroad Purchase Agreement. A new permanent location was found at 31 Penswood Road, just over the bridge. It will become our mother of good counsel. Today, OMGC is not on the Harcum Mile, but Harcum College uses many of its classrooms and the gymnasium for the Harcum College basketball teams. Harcum and OMGC are connected by a brand new bridge. And during its construction, my husband John Jay and I walked over the bridge regularly. And early on, the original railing on both sides of the bridge was revealed and was headed for the dumpster. I turned to my husband and said, we have to find a place for it. Today, most of the original 1860s railing has been relocated along the Morris Avenue side of Melville Hall. By 1896, the church's wood frame structure was replaced with a 3-story stone house with a high-peaked slate roof, a wood porch, and its 2-story barn that you can see in this image. Now, no images exist of Dr. Horne's house, but structural information was collected from atlas maps and partial images in other photos. Now, this view of his barn was taken from Harcum's newly built Penswood Hall during the construction of the Academic Center, seen in the distance. Dr. David Horne was the second person to reside at this location from 1919 until his death in the late 1960s. It was the last house to be purchased by Harcum in 1973 and was the last to be demolished. When photographing the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music for this program, the Barone's spectacular garden was in full bloom. Tony shared that Dr. Horne was known for his garden too, and after he passed away, some of his tiger lilies had spread beyond his property. When Tony was a boy, he collected a few of Dr. Horne's tiger lilies and replanted them behind the Conservatory of Music. Now this is Dr. Horne's tiger lily, still blooming decades later. Our timing couldn't have been more perfect. Now, this was Marin Hall. In 1907, it was the last to be built. The land came from a portion of Dr. Horne's property. And this is the other American foursquare, like Owens Hall. A foursquare house has a square shape and a pyramid roof, which makes them recognizable. The property was purchased by Ms. Ida V. White in 1907. Now, something notable in my research was the number of houses on the Harcum Mile purchased by women at a time when women had few rights. In 1845, Pennsylvania joined other states and passed the Married Women's Property Act to ensure women the security of their home, allowing them to earn an income and support their children if the husbands were not able to do so. It also gave the women the right to purchase and own property. Marin Hall would change hands many times between 1920 and 1956 before it became part of Harcum's campus. The building was named Marin Hall to honor longtime college administrator Maud Marin. Ms. Marin began her tenure at Harcum under the presidency of Edith Harcum following Edith's husband's death. She led the construction of Harcum's Little Theater and continued on during the Klein years for a total of 41 years, retiring in 1962. Mrs. Barone, class of 52, described Ms. Marin as very dignified and formal, with an extraordinary commanding presence. I also heard that the ladies were a bit scared of her. Ms. Marin's office was in Melville Hall on the right, past the lobby. Today, it would be the office of the Vice President of Enrollment Management. This is Richter Hall, and the second to the last house on the mile. In 1885, Mr. Richard W.P. Goff purchased a large corner lot on the end of the Harcum Mile and built a beautiful house. 2 years later, Mr. Goff would hire T. Frank Miller to design a second house in the shingle style with a barn. Now, the shingle style gets its name by the eclectic usage of shingles, roofing, and siding. And here are a few examples of the variety of accents that give this house its beautiful character. It was sold in 1947 when it was labeled the, can you guess it? The cottage dining room, which served as a second tea house on the Harcum Mile. The property was sold to Harcum Junior College in June 1961. Richter Hall was named in honor of the mother of B. Nathaniel Richter, a prominent Philadelphia attorney and benefactor of the college. So here is the original front door with the transom above it. Now, Richter has been altered over the years for academic use, but the windows and doors provide a shadow of the past. And this fireplace we found hidden in a closet, and the original wraparound porch was probably enclosed when it became the cottage dining room. Richter Hall is used for art classes and music lessons, and there were several occasions in the 1980s and 1990s where commencement was held on the land adjacent to Richter. I took this view from Richter's fire escape, which shows the Academic Center and Charles Trout Library in the distance, which replaced 6 of the 14 houses on the Harcum Mile. This is Morris Hall and the last house on the Harcum Mile. Mr. Richard W.P. Goff purchased the land in 1885 to build his primary residence, once located next to Richter Hall. Mr. Goff was a furniture manufacturer of ornate and artistic furniture. The architectural style was fitting considering his occupation. The family owned the home until 1945. This striking Second Empire home is my favorite of all the houses. I just love the porch railing, the detail of the bracketed eave on the porch entrance, and the mansard tower and balcony give the house strength and character. Harcum acquired it around 1957 to operate a licensed nursery school, serving the local community. This unique program offered an associate's degree in nursery school education with real-world experience. So you may have asked yourself, what happened to these houses? The Federal Higher Education Facility Act of 1963 allowed colleges across the country to build, rehabilitate, and otherwise expand campus facilities. The college launched the $8 million initiative called Project 1976. The program would start a building boom that would have completely revised the streetscape. The initial plan for a revisioned Harcum Mile is pictured here. Now, going east from Morris Avenue would be complete with a new dormitory, academic complex, library, a health center, a student activity center, an arts center, an administrative building. By 1963, there were 4 properties on the mile that Harcum did not own: the Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music, the house that would become the President's House, the Colonial Inn, and Dr. Horn's residence. In order for the plan to be realized, Harcum would need to purchase these remaining properties. The Bryn Mawr Conservatory of Music was the only property that would not sell. Development forged ahead, and by 1969, the Harcum Mile would have 3 new buildings. Klein Hall was the first to be completed in 1964 and cost $1.3 million to construct. Penswood Hall Dormitory was completed in 1966, and the Academic Center complex was dedicated on May 3, 1969. The building boom also came with some real estate loss. Of the 14 properties, 8 were razed to make way for the new buildings. The original 1976 project was never fully completed. For 107 years, thousands of students, faculty, and staff have considered the Harcum Mile home, and it all started at the corner of Montgomery and Morris Avenues.